At some point in our lives, we all had to make one of the hardest decisions a trainer could ever make: picking your first Pokemon. For some people, this was rather easy as there was just that one that connected with you. But for others, this was a matter of life and death. It's no big deal. It's just a Pokemon that's gonna stick by your side throughout your entire Pokemon journey as you both face tough experiences up until you enter that sweet, sweet Hall of Fame. Then it just ends up rotting in a box to die as you start racking up shinies and using those instead. But what if our choice of starters were not the ones we know and love? What if Kukui just ran out of Littens and your dreams of becoming a world champion were crushed right there and then? What other Pokemon could even possibly qualify as a starter? Well, that's what we're here to figure out. Today, we're going to be looking at every region so far and finding other potential trios that could qualify as starters if the current ones just didn't exist for some reason. Now, for a lot of regions, coming up with a new grass, fire, and water trio with 3-stage evolutions is just impossible. And to work around that, I'm going to allow 2-stage evolutions for this, with the context that all 3 starters will also have to have the same amount of evolutions just to make it fair. If for some reason it would still be impossible to complete this, then I'll look into different type triangles if they fit the criteria. There are only 3 other perfect type triangles, which I'll get to whenever it's time to talk about them. And spoilers, it's going to come up, so don't worry. Kanto was insanely close to being perfect here, with not 1 but 2 grass options to choose from and a solid stage 2 water evolution with Poliwrath. And while all of these Pokemon need some sort of stone to evolve, I probably would have been fine with letting this slide. Except if you couldn't tell by where I was going with this, there are no other stage 2 fire type Pokemon from Gen 1 besides Charizard. Arcanine, Ninetales, or even Rapidash would have been perfect if any of them had a middle stage, but that's alright. It just means that we have to wipe the slate clean and start with one of those. Now, while my favorite of the 3 mentioned is Ninetales, I think it would be wrong if I didn't go with Arcanine here. But then again, imagine going to Oak's lab to see this little guy waiting for you. Alright, look, if I'm being completely honest, I just couldn't decide between these two. So I'm gonna flip a coin and see where we go from there. Now I hope I don't have to tell you who Tails was. Ninetales I'm pretty sure is a version exclusive along with Growlithe, but for the sake of me not losing my mind, we're going to pretend that this isn't the case, and that they evolved through leveling up instead of using a Firestone. If we care that much, then sure, we could go with Rapidash, but it just doesn't give off as strong of a vibe as the other 2 Pokemon in my opinion. Now choosing a grass starter is pretty easy since there's only 1 real option here. Well, there's actually 2 if for some reason you do want Paris to be the next starter, which I'm assuming is not the case. So the winner for a new starter by a severe lack of competition is Exeggutor. I'm kinda happy with this because Grass and Psychic would be a cool type combination, and I like Exeggutor a lot. However, I'm not sure how I'd feel if the professor offered me this group of scrambled eggs as my lifelong partner. But what other choice do we have here? None, to be honest. But finally, we have the water type remaining, and literally the entire ocean is up for grabs here. We'll start by removing the ones that don't make much sense, and also the Psychic type since we already have a Psychic starter. This still leaves a ton, but there's one that stands out to me so easily, and that is Golduck. This might be a hot take, but I'm pretty sure if we got Let's Go Psyduck instead of Let's Go Pikachu, not a single person would have been upset about it. There's nothing not to love about this little guy until he evolves and then we just forget he exists. But hey, if Ash didn't evolve his Pikachu for 20 plus years, then you don't have to evolve your Psyduck either. But the Kanto trio is finally complete, and it could definitely be worse. And it's about to be worse anyways, because we're at Gen 2, where all of our options are even less than before. Look, I'm just gonna keep it a buck. Johto is looking a little cooked. The region only gave us 100 new Pokemon, and a lot of them are either babies, new evolutions, or just ugly one-ofs that everyone forgets about. We would have Jumpluff for a new 3-stage grass starter, but there aren't any 3-stage fire or water types in the mix. So yeah, it looks like we're going with the 2-stagers again. Luckily for grass, we still have 1 option remaining, which... oh dear god. Sadly, our super duper cool new starter replacing Chikorita is Sunkern. And I know people hate on Chikorita all the time, but we somehow found a way to make it even worse. At least for water, we have some pretty cool choices with Lantern, Quagsire, and Azumarill. Out of all of these, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I might actually give it to Quagsire here. Look, I love Azu as much as you guys do, and I know that Mara looks more like a starter than any of these guys. But then we have the whole thing with Azurill coming a generation later, and I just don't know how to go about something like that. I know I was willing to let the stone evolution thing slide, but I don't know how I'd feel about Thanos snapping an entire Pokemon out of existence. Also, I'm not sure how much of this is an excuse for the fact that I would sacrifice my left arm for Wooper if I could. Seriously, I love this thing so much. But now we're choosing our fire starter, and we have quite the interesting choice. And by that, I mean it's either Houndoom or Magcargo. And this gives me the opportunity to make the funniest starter trio of all time. Yeah, I'm sorry to anybody that has to start their journey here. Moving on to Gen 3, we get so much more choices now with 135 Pokemon to look at. And to make things even better, we even have 2-stage evolutions for both grass and water, except they're the exact same Pokemon. And while we still had one more option for each, fire types ruined it again by not having a 3-stage evolution in this gen. Instead, we are left with our only choice in Numel and Camerot. And honestly, I'm not complaining at all. I think fire and ground is a refreshing change compared to getting 3 fire fighting starters in a row. For water, we actually have 4 choices, but we could cut Whiscash out since we already have a ground starter. So now we have the funny choice between Sharpedo, Pelipper, and the giant whale that is Wailord. Now just imagine your best friend in the whole world being this humongous whale that can't even fit in your house. You could probably fit like 50 camera-ups on this thing's back, and as funny as that would be, I'm gonna hold back for once and pick Sharpedo. There's already some rivalry going on there with everything involving Team Magma and Aqua, so it makes a lot of sense. And if you want a more cool looking water starter, you finally got one 3 gens in, because I know how derpy the other 2 were. And lastly for grass, it's rather easy. Breloom and Cacturne are the only 2 available choices, and with Cacturne and Sharpedo sharing a dark type, we could rule it out for Breloom. So now instead of a fire fighting type, we get a grass and fighting type instead. Overall, this probably is the most cohesive group of starters so far, and by that I just mean they look the best side by side. And now look at that, we're at the gen I started with. Replacing this absolute peak of a starter trio is going to be hard, especially considering one thing. Infernape is such a cool and based Pokemon that Game Freak decided that it's the only new fire type that we needed. They just chose not to add any more fire types in this gen except for Heatran, Magmortar, and Rotom Heat, which didn't even become a fire type until Gen 5. In other words, for the first and perhaps the only time in this video, it's actually impossible to make a cohesive starter trio with the Pokemon we have. But now we get to look back at what I said I would do earlier. In order to make any sort of new starter trio for this gen that isn't just 3 Rotoms, then we might just have to look at another type triangle. We have 3 new options here, and while all of these can be cool, the only one that could possibly work is ground, poison, grass. The rest of them just don't fit with the new Pokemon that Gen 4 gave us. Starting with the ground type, there's only one real option here in Hippowdon. I know that Gastrodon exists, but Shello sadly is pure water, so it wouldn't work. For grass, we have 2 options here, being Cherrim and Abomasnow. And while Abomasnow gives me a bit more of an ice vibe than grass, I think I still prefer it here. Cherrim just isn't that great of a Pokemon, and for a starter, it would feel wrong to me. Also, with Abomasnow setting up Hail with its ability, it could rival with Hippowdon, who sets up Sand with his. And now we get to the poison type starter, and shockingly, we have 3 choices. There is an argument for all of them, and sadly, there is no such thing as a 3-sided coin. So I think we could go with Toxicroak for a similar reason as to why I chose Golduck. Mainly just because Croagunk is really funny and one of the highlights of the Gen 4 anime. I'm not sure how big it is personally, but Croagunk definitely has a fan base that is much bigger than Scorpy or Stunky. Also, I just feel like taking care of a skunk would be painful to deal with. I'm not sure how Jupiter does it, but this might be my favorite starter trio so far, mainly because it's unique and it has 3 of my favorite Gen 4 Pokemon. Oh boy, I see you made it pretty far into the video. If you're enjoying it so far, it would mean a lot to me if you like the video and subscribe. It's a new year and I'm going into it with big dreams and ambitions with the channel, so I'd love to have you along for the ride. Thank you so much as always, and let's move on. Generation 5 is next, and assuming we don't just go with the monkey trio, this one is probably the most interesting. Gen 5 gave us a whopping 150 new Pokemon to look through that are all completely unique and separate from previous games. But the crazy thing is that we don't even have to look that far, because this is the first generation to actually have 3-stage evolutions for grass, fire, and water. And a bit of a spoiler, but this might be the only one. Now this first pick might be a little controversial, but since we could do it, we have Leavanny as the new grass starter. The reason why I say it's controversial is because if we're being technical here, then Bug is actually Leavanny's primary typing. But I always thought that the whole thing of primary and secondary types are a bit stupid. I just don't see why they can't rep both types equally. But then again, it does feel weird for the native Bug to take this slot, but we also just don't have any other option. For fire, we have a very well liked or hated Pokemon depending on who you ask, and that is Chandelure. Shandy is definitely a Pokemon that Game Freak has tried promoting a bit, especially in the non-mainline games like Pokken and Unite. Having a Ghost starter would also be pretty cool, and while people may not like the fact that it's just a Chandelier, the entire line kinda grew on me after a while. Except for Lampet, he's kinda just there. But now for water, we'll be going with the only 3-stage water Pokemon, and that is Seismitoad. This is another weird Pokemon that grew on me, and I swear I'm not doing this just to be different. Sometimes I just have really great experiences with a Pokemon in a Nuzlocke or something, and with Seismitoad, it was definitely one of those times. But there we have it, the closest thing we'll ever get to a perfect replacement trio. And sadly, it's probably not getting any better than this. Gen Gen 6 only having 72 new Pokemon is a little miserable, but I'm starting to learn that having limited choices make my life a lot easier and I should be thankful. Also, I did say this earlier, but every gen from here on out is only gonna have 2-stage evolutions for their starters, because 3-stage evolutions are just impossible at this point. Now, the only new fire Pokemon that was added this gen was Pyroar. It feels a little weird since this would be the first time a starter would have completely different forms, but I'm kind of fine with this. At this point, we're in Gen 6, and it would be about time they tried something different. This would also be the first time we got a normal type starter, which is very weird to think about. Now for grass, we have both of the Ghosty Boys and Go-Go, and while the tree is my favorite Pokemon here, I feel like I have to go with Go-Go. My thinking is that the Ghost guys don't stand out much compared to the other, and your starter should be something unique. And last but not least, we have our water starter with the choice between Clawitzer and Barbaracle. I'm just gonna keep it brief and go with Clawitzer here, just because I think Clauncher is kinda cute, and somebody needs to bring the big guns now that Blastoise is gone. With such a small amount of options, there's not much to say here, and really it could be worse. Now we have reached peak Pokemon with the Alola region. Well, maybe that's not fully true, but I do think Alola gets a lot more hate than it should. I do feel bad that they tried so hard to make a good story after everyone complained about how terrible X and Y's felt, and it was probably their last straw before throwing in the towel and giving us the abomination that was Gen 8. But we'll get back to that shortly. Alola has a few options for each type, and we'll start by making one of the most cursed choices for a water starter ever. You either have to deal with a poison so toxic that a Wailord would be left poisoned for days, or take the chance of an Araquanid drowning you in its bubble because it loves you so much. All of that in mind, I'm actually going with the secret third option that I forgot to mention earlier. Golisopod is probably my favorite of the three, and has the least amount of chance of putting the trainer in danger, considering it also doesn't want to see danger itself. For the grass type Pokemon, sadly Serena is out of the question, but we do get another good option in Fomantis, which looks like a bug but isn't one, so thankfully it does qualify here. It also looks more like a starter than the remaining grass type in Shiinotic, or Shinotic, I don't know how to pronounce that, but lastly for fire, we only have one choice here as well. I'm starting to notice that fire types are lacking in a ton of regions that aren't just Sinnoh, and I'm very confused about it. But anyway, Salandit is a bit weird because only the female ones can evolve, and there's only what, like a 12% chance of your starter being a girl? That would mean that 88% of trainers would be screwed. Maybe Kukui could just make sure that only the female Salandits are raised for new trainers while the rest are set free into the wild, or maybe there's a better way of doing it. Either way, that's his problem, not ours. Now we're slowly inching towards the end, but at least we don't have to end on a low note since we're getting that out of the way now. Okay, I might just be being a little too harsh on Galar for no reason, because one of the things I do like about Gen 8 is some of the Pokemon designs, but sadly we don't get to use any of them today. And even worse, we'll be starting with the one that I like the least in Scorch. We're actually getting a lot of bug types in this video, which is pretty surprising to me, and it could have been even more if he chose Drapion, but oh well. The honorable mention that I want to bring up is Colossal. It wouldn't work due to there not being enough stage 3s and the fact that Roly-Poly is not a fire type to begin with. But hey, for a bug type, Scorch actually has some really good stats and it could Gigantamax, which actually we might have a small problem with later. The water starter of choice here is going to be Dreadnought, who in its own right isn't terrible in my opinion. And depending on how you feel about Inteleon, this might actually even be an upgrade. If you were curious, the only other option for a water starter is Barraskewda. I'm not entirely sure why, but we never actually got a fish as a water starter before, and we're just not gonna start today. Now we get to the actual problem, and it's the grass starter. If you didn't realize, both Scorch and Dreadnought are capable of Gigantamaxing, which means it would be cool if the third could as well. The first option is Eldegoss, who for some reason just never got a G-Max form. They made it Milo's ace, and he's the only gym leader that just uses regular Dynamax for some reason. We also have Applin, who has not just 2 evolutions, but G-Max forms for both of them as well. He also got some new evolutions in Gen 9, and it's just crazy to think about how much attention they gave this thing. I really want to leave this open-ended for you guys to talk about, so for me, it's time to bring back the coin. And we're going with heads for Eldegoss because come on, just look at it. Dang, I was actually kind of rooting for Eldegoss here, but oh well. And last but not least, we get to close this out with one of my favorite regions. I don't get to talk about Scarlet and Violet that much, but the things they do get right are absolutely perfect. And these Pokemon designs are no exception. And then you remember why we're here. And then we're left with Squidward and the Tumbleweed. Now the only potential fire starter here is Charcadet. And while the idea of split evolution still throws me off, I think I'm alright with this. Charcadet does have a pretty good fan base, with both armor Armarouge and Ceruledge being Paldea fan favorites, so I don't think this would be anything people would be upset about, unless you really love to hate whatever's popular. And I know there are a few of you guys out there. But now we have the sad choice between Toedscruel and Brambleghast as our grass starter. I like these Pokemon a lot actually, especially Toedscruel, but as starters, not so much. Brambleghast doesn't look that much different when you evolve it, and Toedscruel resembles Tentacool a little too much, which I get was very intentional, but I also believe that a starter is a big representation of their region, and having your starter being based off of a Pokemon from Gen 1 doesn't really do that, which means by default we're going with Brambleghast and whatever its pre-evo is called. And now we have one last decision to make, and it's our final water starter of the day. We have a great lineup of Pokemon here with Palafin and Wugtrio. Both are very interesting in their own rights, and who am I kidding, man? I'd much rather climb to the top of Mesagoza and jump off before choosing Wiglet as my starter. And now while these starters are the most unique from how traditional starters are, I think this might actually be my favorite duo trio. Gen 9 was an era of a lot of new mechanics and abilities, and all three of these Pokemon embody that very well, so I'm happy about it. Anyways, I know this video is a bit different from what I usually do, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you have your own ideas for starters, feel free to let me know in the comments. I hope you guys have a good one, and I'll see you soon. Bye!